And welcome to Boxing During Dinner. I'm your host, David Barry. We're here tonight without Armando. I'm going to tell you why in a second. But to my right, we've got Dustin Elliott, a guest tonight with our show. He's with Betancourt Nutrition. We'll be talking about performance-enhancing drugs in the sport of boxing. To my left, Sam Cohen of the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame, Vice President. The annual ceremony for the induction for the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame coming up this weekend. We're going to talk about all that tonight. But before we get to that, you're probably wondering where Armando is. Well, he finally ate fish and he's dead. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Armando did not die. He's just not here tonight. That's a pretty sick joke on my part, isn't it?
I love it.
Why not? He's not here. Well, I can say whatever I want.
You want.
Whatever I want. It's my show tonight. Actually, Armando's out on another assignment. He will be back with us next week. But before we dig into all this stuff about performance-enhancing drugs and the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame, which is an awesome, awesome thing going on for Florida boxing fans, I want to talk about something that's really got the boxing world abuzz this weekend. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. takes out in a 7th round brutal thrashing TKO Andy Lee. Sam, you caught the fight. What did you think?
I saw the fight, and I just think that Chavez completely dominated Andy Lee. I actually thought that Andy Lee would do better with his jab, but it all comes down to there's no real comparison, a jabber against a puncher, and Chavez is a great puncher. His body punching, his actual dominance of Andy Lee, I mean, was just an unreal feat for him. And now that I just heard today that Chavez is going to fight Martinez. I think that's going to be quite something to see. And from what I saw of Chavez against Lee, I think he's going to have a hell of a shot against Martinez.
That's a really interesting point. In fact, I just wrote an article today for BoxingDuringDinner.com, and the title was From Punchline to Puncher: The Evolution of Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Who would have thought that even 12 months ago we would be saying that Julio Cesar Chavez has a chance against Sergio Martinez? But lo and behold, this guy's a freight train who's one of the most vicious body punchers in the sport, and he can take a punch. Sergio Martinez is going to be 38 years old by the time this fight comes around. Chavez is 25, 26. This is a very interesting fight.
It's going to be a very interesting match, and it's something that I'm sure all the fans are going to want to see. I mean, everybody's talking about Pacquiao and Mayweather, but here we are with Martinez and Chavez.
Yep.
And Chavez is an up-and-coming guy. He's an up-and-coming fighter. He's got a great trainer in Freddie Roach.
Yep.
I can't wait to see that match.
Crazy to think that that's going to happen. Talking about September, October for that fight, it's going to be a unification fight for the middleweight title, which in history has been one of the most glorified belts in all of boxing. Now it's actually a legitimate fight, something we didn't think was not such a short, long time ago.
The fans, have been talking about not having the chance to see legitimate fights and seeing the unification of belts. But here's a chance where the fans are going to actually get to see it.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to it, and I can't wait.
Me too. Count me in. Before, so we're wrapped up with fights now. We want to get on now to something that we previewed a couple weeks ago, and that is performance-enhancing drugs in the sport of boxing. Now, very, very recently, we have the example of Floyd Mayweather, of course, demanding random blood testing in all of his fights in recent memory. But then, of course, a lot of other fighters jumping on board. So you have Lamont Peterson making that request for his rematch against Amir Khan, and then Andre Berto making that request for his rematch against Victor Ortiz. What an interesting dilemma develops after that. Lamont Peterson tests positive for synthetic testosterone in his blood and thus cancels his rematch against Amir Khan. And then just a few short weeks later, Andre Berto, another one bites the dust, tests positive for traces of nandrolone in his blood, which cancels his rematch against Victor Ortiz. With us tonight, the head designer of supplements at Betancourt Nutrition, a former bodybuilder, former college football player, Dustin Elliott, who is an expert in this realm, and if you don't know him by name, you will. Check us out on Twitter and BoxingDuringDinner.com, our Facebook page. We're going to have links to articles that Dustin's written, because there's a lot to talk about on this subject that we're not going to have time to really dive into tonight. Dustin, the first question I want to ask you, Lamont Peterson tests positive for synthetic testosterone. Now, if he's taking a urine test, from my understanding, this positive test does not show up because his actual testosterone ratios are still below what was considered the quote-unquote legal limit. But what was discovered in a blood test is that he was using synthetic testosterone. What does this mean? And can you shed some light on what he was trying to accomplish? And is there an argument to be made for the fact that he was prescribed this by a physician? As a professional fighter, do you even have the luxury of taking a synthetic drug like that?
Good question. For starters, it all depends on the sensitivity of the test. You can detect synthetic testosterone through a urine test. It all depends on who's testing it, what facilities. Really what they found out is that even if your testosterone is below the ratio, on the molecular level, they can tell the difference between synthetic and naturally occurring testosterone. In Lamont Peterson's case, unfortunately, this was the result of ignorance on his part. At 28 years old, being a fighter who trains on a regular basis, his testosterone levels are going to be normal, if not higher than the average person on a regular basis.
Okay.
The problem is, if you look at the time period in which he was tested in, and the time period in which he used the testosterone pellets in, all these fighters have a huge staff, and there's a lack of communication between their doctors and their trainers. In his case, what ended up happening was while he's cutting for a fight and undergoing strenuous exercise, his testosterone levels will naturally decline.
Okay.
And that's not to say that there's a lack of fairness there, because it's going to happen to every fighter as they cut weight and continue a high volume of training. Unfortunately with him, he went to a doctor, showed the doctor's declined testosterone levels, which was considered to be below par for being 28 years old. And of course the doctor, unknowingly didn't know the rules, prescribed him testosterone pellets, standard procedure if your testosterone is below normal levels. Now, is it to say that it's fair or unfair? Well, maybe his testosterone wasn't at the level it needed to be for him to be necessarily enhancing his performance.
Okay.
But it's still unfair to the other fighter, because the other fighter is undergoing the same conditions as him, strenuous exercise, cutting weight quickly for a fight. So for him to use testosterone because his levels had declined, the only real way to know what his testosterone levels are to test his levels in the off season when they would be at their peak, and not to test them while he's undergoing stress.
Okay.
So unfortunately, did Peterson, juice or attempt to cheat during the fight? In this case, maybe not, because his testosterone levels weren't high enough for him to enhance his performance. But is it cheating and is it against the rules? Yes, unfortunately, it definitely is.
Would you say that in this scenario, it's a fighter feels that his body's not performing at its peak, and because of that, maybe it's an indication of a fighter who's doing too much to lose the weight, that their testosterone levels would plummet that much, that to the point that they feel they need to replenish it through unnatural means?
Well, in this particular case, to answer your question, first of all, fighters are always trying to push the limit. Any athlete is, and that's the reason why you have so many of these borderline tests where it's slightly over the hump, not to the point where they're necessarily trying to full-blown cheat, but it is still considered cheating. They're pushing the limits of the standards and the rules that have been given. But in his particular case, one of the things that you have to look at is his results were the reason for him taking action. Maybe not necessarily the way he felt. A lot of the cases when it comes to athletes is that the results of all these tests and all this blood work that they do to stay at peak condition, it can affect their mood, as opposed to a fighter, say, years ago, who didn't know the results of all kinds of testing and all the sophisticated things that were going on nowadays. It wouldn't have affected their mood. Their placebo effect is real, and a fighter knowing that his testosterone levels are lower or that these levels are lower, it'll in turn make him maybe think that he's performing less.
Sure. If you're losing your train of thought with all this information, imagine how complicated it is to actually test for this stuff. For them to find synthetic testosterone in a guy whose levels were still within the legal limit. Transitioning to a different scenario. Now, testosterone can be viewed as, in this scenario, you can make an argument for Lamont Peterson or against him. We'll leave that to you guys to decide ultimately if he's considered quote-unquote guilty. Andre Berto tests positive for nandrolone in his blood test, and his results were indicative of not somebody who was intentionally doping, but of somebody who may have taken either, what's the word here, basically trace supplements,
Supplements with trace
amounts of it,
this, yeah.
Right, a supplement with a trace amount, or a tainted meat dish or something like that. How do you explain a professional athlete at the level of Andre Berto, a world champion, taking either a tainted supplement or tainted meat, if you will, especially under the guidance of someone like Victor Kani, who's had his name dragged through the mud for years now because of his connection to performance-enhancing drugs.
Through Balco. This guy is a king of untraceable steroids.
Right.
So if he is in any way connected to this fighter testing positive, I mean, it would be the dumbest thing in the world for him to take one of the most common pro hormones on the market, one of the cheapest, most common pro hormones in the market, and to give it to his fighter to enhance his performance, especially coming into a fight when really nandrolone's not going to help you that much. It would be something great for training volume in the offseason, but it has everything indicative of ignorance in this case, and Victor Conte himself said that his fighter took supplements that weren't approved by him leading into this fight.
It's very interesting how you expect that at this professional level that fighters are very, very knowledgeable about every single thing that would go into their body, that they would have people advising them. And even in this scenario of Andre Berto, he has Victor Kani advising him, and he still managed to do something outside of the realm of what's acceptable. It makes you wonder, and I don't mean in any way to try to create a bigger issue than what exists, but it is interesting to say that the first two fighters outside of Floyd Mayweather who demand random blood testing for their fights, ironically, are the ones who tested positive, and that's 2 for 2. Is this indicative of a bigger issue in the sport of boxing? I'm afraid to say that it might. I don't believe that a lot of these fighters are dumb enough to intentionally dope, but I think that these two scenarios are providing a little bit of light to the scenario that fighters are still not knowledgeable, even when they think that they are, of what is going into their body and ultimately how it affects them when it comes to testing and maybe ultimately in their performance as well. Dustin, like I said, expert with performance-enhancing drugs. As you can see, Betancourt Nutrition. We're going to have links on our Facebook, Twitter, and website that's going to give you more information and links to articles so you can learn more about this important topic. It's not an issue, I think, that's going away, and you can expect to see him back here talking a little bit more about it. Thank you very much, Dustin, for being here. Transitioning now on a little bit of a lighter note to the gentleman on my left, the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame, for those of you who don't know, I guess it would be called a hidden gem to you in the state of Florida. Based in Tampa. We've got the induction ceremony coming up starting on Friday the 22nd this week. Sam, we've got some really big names coming. We've got Aaron Pryor, Roberto Duran, Antonio Vijar. Let's hear it.
Danny Nadico. We've got a lot of Dr. Simpson. We got Ron Ross, a celebrated author who's written several books on boxing, one of which is Plummy Davis versus Murder Incorporated, and 9, 10 and Out, the story of Emil Griffith. He's going to be there doing seminars. We got a great program coming up starting on Friday night at the West Shore Hotel in Tampa, starting with a Friday night cocktail party. All day Saturday, we've got a beautiful program of boxing. We're going to have a ring set up at the ballroom of the West Shore Hotel. Okay. We'll have sparring. We're going to have fist casting where the fans can actually have their fist casted along with the champions. Some of the champions we expect to be present: Antonio Tarver, Winky Wright, Aaron Pryor. We've got a growing community of sponsors, and they just grow every year. Alessi Bakeries, Phil Alessi, Sergio Printing, Sergio Fernandez. A favorite of mine is Joe Rodriguez from Cheetah's Nightclubs. He's all there, and you know, it's just.
I wonder why that's a favorite.
It's just Steve Yerritt. Steve Yerritt. Oh, and let me mention that one of the other great champions who was there, and he's a great supporter, and he was an inductee in the 2009 class of the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame, is Pinklin Thomas. Pinklin Thomas has a charity, it's a 501c3 as we are, Project Pink, and anybody that comes in and brings a gift of a children's book gets a special gift from the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame.
What's not to like?
It's just a great time, and in 4 years I haven't seen anybody leave the place that hasn't said, wow, boy, was I glad to be here this weekend.
Excellent. All right, so the information, that if you guys can't retain all of it, we don't expect you to. On the bottom of the screen, we're going to have the website and every information if you want to learn more. We encourage, if you can't make it out for the whole weekend, which you should, but if you can't, there's events starting just at $5. Bring your family. If you're a fight fan in the state of Florida, this is definitely worth the trip. Wyndham Hotel, Tampa, Florida, 2012 induction celebration for the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame. Before we get out of here, Sam Cohen to my left, Dustin Elliott to my right. Want to thank them both very much for being here. And next week, we're going to be talking, we're looking forward this weekend to the Victor Ortiz, Jose Cito Lopez clash on Showtime. Be sure to tune into that. All of our information will be right here. Box During Dinner on Twitter, facebook.com/boxingduringdinner. Armando will be back next week. We'll see you next week.